Hi, everyone. I hope you're all safe and healthy. Thank you for joining our Policy Lab today. Yesterday, September the 15th, the foreign ministers of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signed an agreement at the White House, normalizing the relations with Israel. An agreement that has only made public relations that have been under the table for a long period of time. What are the different factors behind Arab normalization, and why has its pace accelerated recently? What is the impact of Arab normalization on the Palestinian cause, and what should Palestinians do in response? To discuss these questions and many others, I'm very delighted that we have with us today Ibrahim Fraihat and Tareq Baconi. Ibrahim Fraihat is Professor of International Conflict Resolution at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He previously served as Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Tareq Baconi is currently a Senior Analyst with the International Crisis Group and was the former US Policy Fellow of Al-Shabaka. And I am Noor Arafeh. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford, and I will be moderating today's Policy Lab. So during the first 30 minutes, it's going to be a discussion or a conversation between me, Ibrahim, and Tareq, and then we will try to address all the questions you have. So please, if you have any questions, there's like at the bottom of the page, there's something that says ask a question, so please feel free to ask a question or to vote for the question that you want us to answer. So Ibrahim, Arab normalization has been ongoing for a long period of time and has especially gained momentum recently under the Trump administration. In your opinion, what have been the drivers of Arab normalization with Israel historically and at the present, and how have the aspects of Arab normalization evolved over time?
Thank you, Noor, and thanks to Al-Shabaka for hosting this timely and important Policy Lab discussion about this serious development in the region and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Let me begin with looking at two different paradigms, the way I'm seeing this, in terms when we talk about the causes of Arab normalization and the nature of normalization process that's taking place at the time. Historically, since you asked about the history, historically we had two peace agreements between Israel and Arab countries, Jordan and Egypt. And the model or the paradigm at the time was for the first two cases of Arab normalization was driven by this principle of peace for land. You know, there is an occupied Arab land by Israel in 1967 war, and there is a state of war between Israel and the neighboring countries. And in 1978, Egypt reached an understanding, a peace agreement, Camp David agreement with Israel, you know, that would for Israel to withdraw from the occupied Sinai. And for peace agreement or peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. In 1994, similar thing happened with Jordan and Israel, another peace treaty based on the same model, land for peace, which is basically withdrawing from the occupied Jordanian land as well. And of course, the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel was driven by the Palestinian-Israeli peace accord or Oslo Accord done in 1993, which also is built on the same model, which is basically a withdrawal from the 1967 occupied Palestinian land for recognition of Israel. In 2002, we had the Arab Peace Initiative that emphasized the same exact paradigm, which is basically in the Arab League summit in Beirut, Saudi Arabia offered an initiative, which is called, again, the Arab Peace Initiative, for a full withdrawal of occupied Arab land by Israel, for a full normalization of all 23 Arab countries, basically ending the state of war between Israel and all Arab countries for the return of 1967 borders. So since 2002, this is the paradigm also that continued to drive Arab peace talks, right? For the first time, now we're seeing a new paradigm is being born, which is basically by United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, that A, they're not neighboring countries of Israel. B, they don't have an occupied Emirati or Bahraini land by Israel. And three, they've never been in war with Israel, like again Jordan and Egypt in the past. So this is, we're seeing a whole new model that's again being built, which is basically, I'm not a big fan of the term normalization, because again, normalization happens between two parties that are in a state of war, and then they decide to end the state of war and engage in normalizing their relationships. UAE and Bahrain and other Arab countries, not the only two countries, had relationships between, with Israel in the past 20 years. Like this is one of the statements made by Yedaot Ahranot's chief editor, saying that we had this relationship for the past 20 years. And what happened is that we just, took it to another level, is to go public, right? So again, the relationship did exist before, but now we're seeing a whole new thing. Now, what is the nature of this new paradigm is basically, it's not normalization, as I said, it's more of an alliance between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, which has a very clear or specific agenda between the two parties. And at the core of this agenda, one is that confronting Iran. Two, which also emerged recently, confronting Turkey or the Turkish influence, because Turkey's influence is also expanding in the region. In Libya, there is some sort of also a proxy conflict between UAE on one side with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey and Libya and Qatar is on the other side in Libya. So, and Israel definitely has tense relationship with Turkey at the time. So we have Iran, we have also Turkey is being added to this, but also there are other important points on the agenda that drive this alliance, which is part of the declared or of the open UAE regional policy, is to reshape the politics or to reshape the political map of the Middle East, which when we talk about reshaping the political map of the Middle East means for the UAE, the way it is declared publicly and openly, fighting political Islam. And here by political Islam, I'm not referring necessarily to ISIS or other radical groups, but mainstream political Islam like the Muslim Brotherhood. And two, also at the core of this regional agenda for the UAE is ending the calls for change and democratization and accountability, and the slogans or the principles were advocated or pursued by the Arab Spring revolutions. Basically is that for the UAE is launching or leading a counter-revolution along with Saudi Arabia and Egypt in order to end these calls or Arab Spring revolutions and try to restore the old regional system about basically dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, which is basically is to put an end to the calls for change and democratization in the Middle East. One last point, if you give me one more minute, why this is happening now, right? Mm-hmm. Why? Because the timing is, in my view, is very critical, is very important. And in my view, I think a major reason behind the timing that's happening now is that very simple and very clear. We're only almost 2 months away from someone else will be in the White House, or the same person Donald Trump continuing in the White House. Now, as you know, is that polls in the United States, showing that Joe Biden is taking the lead in most polls in the U.S. at the moment, and there is a serious risk for them, for the UAE and Israel, by the way, because also Israel had a relatively tough relationship with Obama when he was in office. So there is a risk of the Democrats coming back to the White House in November. So in order to, because of this, again, risk, or because of this concern on the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel on that side, there is this tendency, or this cause, or this factor, is that they try to set up the arrangement for them, or for the alliance, to continue without Donald Trump if Joe Biden comes back to the White House. And not only this, but also to be able to influence the White House because of this alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. So you have regional players, right? And this is also made openly and publicly by the UAE ambassador in Washington, D.C., Al-Otaiba, saying openly again that is to shape or to influence the White House, the U.S. government, to shape the politics of the Middle East. So I think that played an important and a relevant factor, is for this new paradigm of an alliance, not a normalization that's happening, unlike the way it is being used. And for that, I think we're seeing this being done now, is to make the arrangements again before the U.S. elections in early November.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for giving us this insightful perspective into the recent developments. Many Palestinian officials described the UAE and Bahrain's deal with Israel as a stab in the back, or as a betrayal of Palestinians within a larger framework of the so-called regional peace that has been dictated by the Trump administration. But there has been very limited analysis of the actual impact of recent Arab normalization on the Palestinian cause. So I'd like to ask both of you, Tareq and Ibrahim, about what you think is the impact and the different ramifications of recent Arab normalization on Palestinians and their struggle for freedom. Tareq, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Shabaka, for hosting this timely webinar, and thank you, Ibrahim, for your insight in beginning this. So I'm going to make three main points. I'm going to talk about the immediate implications of the new alliance, as Ibrahim is calling it. I'm going to talk a bit about the longer term implications, and then I want to talk about the regional implications. So in terms of the immediate implications of this, the very clear implication is that the Palestinians are more diplomatically isolated and vulnerable than they had been before these deals took place. That's not to say that there had never been a kind of a betrayal or a kind of co-optation by Arab regimes of the Palestinian cause. Historically, from the days of the PLO being established onwards, there had always been a double politics that was happening, where the Palestinian revolution would look for its Arab depth and its alliances in the region, while at the same time Arab regimes would co-opt the Palestinian struggle, both to deflect from their own internal issues, but also in order to strengthen their hold on their regimes and on the region. So there's always been a difficult relationship between the Palestinian movement and the Arab regimes. What happened, however, in the Arab Peace Initiative, which Ibrahim spoke about, is that there was at least a formalization of an Arab position around the Land for Peace model. The Arab League, through the Arab Peace Initiative, provided Palestinians with some level of diplomatic cover and with some level of support on the international stage. With these deals happening now, the Arab Peace Initiative is disintegrating in terms of its impact to give the Palestinians the political and the diplomatic leverage they need. So I think the most immediate implications of those deals is the fact that the Palestinians are now more vulnerable than they had been before it. even, as I said, taking into context how effective the Arab Front was, even with that caveat, nonetheless, the collapse of the Arab Peace Initiative in the way we understand it leaves Palestinians more vulnerable to whatever policies that the US administration, the current one or the next one, is putting forward. So that's sort of the first point that I want to make in terms of the immediate implications. The longer term implications have to do with the reversal of the paradigm that Ibrahim spoke about. The Arab Peace Initiative and certainly the different peace treaties that happened between Jordan and Egypt and Israel all were based on a land for peace model, which meant that there was a concession that was expected from the Israelis, which was to withdraw from occupied Palestinian territories in return for a stronger or normalized relationship with Arab regimes. Now, the paradigm is a peace for peace paradigm, where the Arab regimes actually pursue peace with Israel, not based on it ending the occupation, but only because they want to make peace with Israel for its economic power, for its diplomatic power, for its military power, for access into the White House. So all of those factors remove the need or the pressure on Israel to relinquish Palestinian land. Now, the longer term implication of that is that the Palestinian statehood project, as it's understood today, as rooted in the Oslo Accords, no longer necessarily holds. This is a significant blow to the idea that peace with Israel will come through Israel relinquishing its hold on Palestinian lands. The idea that now even the Arab states have accepted for this model to be shaped or reshaped or inverted, I should say, means that the Palestinians are in a position where they have to question whether a project that they had dedicated themselves to for the past 3 decades is working. I think that what we see now from this new alliance that is emerging is that the Palestinians are, as I said, more isolated, but also it's less likely that their statehood project, which they had committed to, is working. Now, this longer term implication is both negative and positive. Obviously, the positive side is that it shows that a long awaited renewal is needed. So it shows that the performance of statehood and sovereignty by the Palestinian leadership now needs to be revisited. There's no longer the fig leaf, I should say, or the facade of statehood has been removed in a very powerful way, even though many would argue it's been removed for some time. So the positive here is that this is a call for renewal. The negative, of course, is that the Palestinian leadership is unclear on how it's going to use this opportunity. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in the next line of questions. The third point that I want to make is on the regional implications. And here, there's again, immediate implications and longer term implications. The immediate implications, Ibrahim touched on some of them. The first is that political Islam is now more isolated and more under threat than before. And this has immediate implications on Hamas and Hamas's situation in the Gaza Strip. What is the UAE's policy here? How will it impact the way that Qatar gets involved in the Gaza Strip? Is there stronger pressure against Qatar's involvement, a stronger support of Israeli attacks against the Gaza Strip? Those are all immediate implications. And the second immediate implication, of course, is the fact that the new alliance that's emerging in the Middle East, the way I think about it is that the counter-revolution is getting formalized now. This counter-revolution is a securitized one that's based on intelligence sharing with the Israelis. It's based on despotic regimes gaining hold. And obviously, this has implications on the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian Authority. What kind of alliances are they forming? Are they going to become counter-revolution, or are they going to go back into their revolutionary roots, which are, of course, threatening to the Arab regimes elsewhere? The longer-term implications, and I'll leave this as a sort of a question for some of the discussion that we'll have later about the way forward for Palestinians, is that now the Palestinians are stuck between their history of being a revolutionary movement that's rooted in a popular struggle, that's rooted in the people, that aligns itself with the people of the Arab world, and between a leadership that has become more authoritarian, more set in its ways, more focused on performances of statehood and state building, and more naturally allied with some of the authoritarian regimes in the region. And this new alliance or these normalization deals is showing very, very clearly that junction.
Thank you so much, Tareq. Ibrahim, what's your take on the impact of what you call this recent alliance between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel on the Palestinian cause?
Thank you. I think Tareq mentioned very important points here about the implication. I agree with him totally. Let me focus on other things just to build on what Tareq mentioned. There is no doubt that this alliance has serious implications for the Palestinian cause. One of them is the legitimization of the occupation in the eyes of of some Arab countries. Basically, two Arab countries accepting the status quo of Israel being in control of East Jerusalem and the West Bank and so forth. So at the time where the world and the is developing response to the Israeli occupation and the apartheid regime being in the Palestinian territories, boycotting Israel and pressuring Israel to stop the discrimination against the Palestinians there. We're seeing two Arab countries that are embracing this and building a relationship or legitimizing the Israeli control and the apartheid system it maintains in Palestine. The other major impact, in my view, we in conflict resolution pay close attention to the balance of power and its relationship to peace building and achieving peace. And I think, what this happens is that Palestinians lost major supporters. Like two key Arab countries, in this conflict with the Palestinians, which what this does, in fact, is further imbalancing the already imbalanced relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis, which makes it, which poses the question is that what would incentivize Israel now to engage in peace? In peace building and in ending this conflict, because this was part of the idea of the Arab Peace Initiative: build peace, engage with peace with everyone, and then you have the markets, the Arab markets, and everything is open for you. Now, if Israel gets this, what would then incentivize Israel to engage in serious peace? But nevertheless, because again of this power relationship and the imbalancing of the imbalanced relationship or the asymmetric relationship between the Palestinians and Israelis, I think this presents a serious and a unique opportunity for the Palestinians as a wake-up call. The Palestinians have been living in this illusion about the Oslo agreement or the Oslo Accord achieving a peaceful solution to the conflict with Israel and engaging in futile negotiations, pointless, useless negotiations since 1993 until now, is that thinking that the negotiations and the quartet and supported by the United States and Russia and all of that, that's what give them a state and end of occupation. Enough. Stop this. This is not getting you anywhere. This is you're only living in an illusion. This is not going to happen. So this is a wake-up call, is that the Arab Peace Initiative for the Palestinians, it's no longer the driving paradigm that for peaceful negotiations that Israel believes in. Israel does not believe in the Arab Peace Initiative, does not believe in this negotiation. So I think this throws the ball in the court of the Palestinians. It's a wake-up call. You yourself needs to address the power relations with Israel. Power is not only nuclear weapons. Power is international solidarity. Power is your moral power, is your ethical principles about the freedom, justice, peace. This is what the Palestinians stand for. They don't have to have nuclear capabilities in order to fight Israel or to confront Israel. The apartheid in South Africa did not collapse because the black community earned or possessed nuclear weapons. So the Palestinians have a lot that they can do, and I think this peace or normalization or alliance between UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, call it whatever you want to call it, is a liberating force. Should be a liberating mechanism for the Palestinians, is to wake up and not to continue to be delusioned about the possibility of achieving peace, through this model. So I think the opportunity is there, and this could be, or the Palestinians, if they perform well, this could be turned from a threat to opportunity. And it's the Palestinian cause is to try to convert it to an opportunity. And I think the potential does exist for this, and the Palestinians must grab this opportunity. Because if you allow me one last thing, Noor, I know you want me to finish on this, because over the past also decades of the Palestinian being supported financially by Arab countries, this also for the Palestinian developed an attitude of dependency, right, of the Palestinian leadership. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is that to depend on the financial support coming from Arab countries. It also developed a sense of entitlement within the Palestinian leadership. We're entitled to this. No, you have to do your work. You have to do your job as the Palestinian leadership in order to be able to make difference. And this should be a liberating from this liberating mechanism, from this illusion called about reaching peace or ending the occupation through negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I want us to build on what you just mentioned about what the Palestinian leadership can do and should do. So basically, in response to the agreement that was signed, Fatah and Hamas, they have been engaging in talks to restore unity and put an end to the division that dates back to 2007. They also agreed on a so-called unified field leadership that would lead popular resistance against the occupation, and they called on Palestinians to participate in demonstrations yesterday as part of what they called a day of rage, or like a day of popular rejection. Tareq, before we talk about what Palestinians should do, how would you assess the Palestinian response so far to these different efforts of Arab countries normalizing their relations with Israel?
Thanks, Noor. I mean, I would assess it as ineffective, quite frankly. I think that, first of all, I want to say that I completely agree with everything that Ibrahim said. And I think this is a moment of opportunity, which so far the Palestinian leadership does not seem to be capable of grasping or even understanding it as a moment of opportunity. And I'll add one more point to what Ibrahim said. Apart from the Palestinian leadership, I should say, having become entitled and dependent, it's also become victimized in the sense that it constantly plays up the idea that everything that is happening, whether it's the Trump plan, whether it's Israeli settlement expansion, whether it's military assaults on Gaza, are forcing it in a role of victimization, which of course it is, and they are, because the Palestinians are colonized subjects in this case, and they are victims of Israeli colonization. But this positioning also removes the idea of Palestinian agency, of what Palestinians can do in order to respond. And the way that the Palestinian leadership so far has responded, the examples that you gave, Noor, really need to be understood in the context of how Palestinians have been responding for the past few years to the Trump attack on the Palestinian movement. This is in some ways a continuation of those policies. And we've seen several attempts of trying to respond. We've seen attempts to take resolutions at the UN Security Council or at the Arab League in order to condemn the Trump actions or to condemn the Arab agreements. We've seen attempts to end security coordination, which have never gone to the level of what they promised to be. And we've seen attempts at unity. which is before the one that you talked about now, which is the unity around popular committees and the formation of this kind of struggle. There was, if you recall, before the prospective annexation date of July, a meeting between Hamas and Fatah that also tried to put forward a united front against annexation. So there's a performance that reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah is in the cards, and that this will re-strengthen the Palestinians and promote a united view against all these attacks that are happening against the Palestinian movement. The problem with all of those initiatives, apart from the fact that diplomatically they fail to garner enough support, whether at the Arab League or at the UN Security Council, is that locally they still happen within the institutions of governance that were defined by the Oslo Accords, whether we're thinking about security coordination or we're thinking about unity between Hamas and Fatah within the bodies of the PA, within the body of the PA. All of those reactions are still taking place within the very accords that this new alliance and the Trump administration, certainly the Israeli government under Netanyahu, has rendered meaningless. So it's all of the actors around the Palestinians have broken out of that straitjacket, and it's only Palestinians who are defining the limits of their response within a political body that is focused on governance, not focused on liberation. So if all of their actions are limited to what the limits of the PA are, then they are already disenfranchised in how they can effectively respond to this. So I know that you want to talk a bit about the way forward, and Ibrahim talked about it as well a bit. I just want to make two quick points here. Is that the idea of popular resistance and the idea that that popular resistance can be rejuvenated by the factions from the top down, by a directive from the PA, fails to take into account the fact that the PA itself, and in some ways the factions, have lost legitimacy among the Palestinian people and no longer represent the kind of political project or the kind of liberation struggle that the Palestinian people need or are calling for. And so the idea that that kind of day of rage is a sufficient response to what's happening is a really tragic and dangerous misunderstanding of the situation that's happening now. The second is that over the course of the past 3 decades, all the institutions of liberation of the Palestinian people have become subsumed. And I'm sure Ibrahim will talk about this in the way defining the way forward to the need to go back to some kind of liberation struggle. We need to understand that the Palestinian as a people, as a revolutionary project, needs to be resuscitated. And here is where the opportunity that Ibrahim is talking about presents itself. Because if we're looking at the alliance that's emerging now in the region, the alliance is happening between Arab regimes that are not representative and Israel. The Arab public is still supportive of the Palestinian struggle. And this is a card of strength that the Palestinian leadership can use to talk about the balance of power. To go back into a revolutionary movement, there's an Arab depth here that is underutilized and underappreciated. And so I think that the Palestinian leadership now is obviously blind to that fact or unwilling to use it because the current situation serves it quite well. And so the way forward is to break out of that chokehold.
Thank you so much, Tareq. Ibrahim, very quickly, because you mentioned in your last answer to one of my questions that what happened can be seen as an opportunity for Palestinians. Can you elaborate on this? How can it be an opportunity, and what more should Palestinians, in your opinion, do?
Thank you, Noor, and thank you, Tareq. Yes, actually, the issue is building on this opportunity, and I believe the opportunity does exist. And for that, I presented as a way forward, to respond to this development, is what I call the fourth paradigm. Basically, when we talk about how the Palestinians should end the occupation and earn their freedom, basically there are 3 existing paradigms that deal with this question. One is that the Palestinians historically played, which is the armed resistance, basically, that Fatah gave up and abandoned in 1993, but Hamas in Gaza today is still holding to this and advancing an armed resistance, freedom through armed resistance. And the second paradigm, which is the Oslo Arab Peace Initiative, basically an independent Palestinian state through negotiations. And there is a third paradigm, which is the Donald Trump paradigm, which is called the deal of the century, which is basically for the Palestinian is a surrender, is that to accept the way unilaterally set by Benjamin Netanyahu about the end of the conflict, which is basically, again, a surrender and an apartheid Bantustan type of paradigm. None of this works for the Palestinian, right? Now, what should work and the Palestinians is that to work on the fourth paradigm, which is basically capitalizes on the moral and ethical power of the Palestinian cause and the just cause of the Palestinians, and building on what's called the soft power paradigm, basically building on their soft power combined with the popular resistance, which is also Tareq mentioned. Now, soft power, the Palestinians cannot and will not be allowed to have solid power. So forget it. So the armed resistance is not going to work. Now, what they can work, and this is where they have the upper hand, right, on that when it comes to the conflict over Israel, which is the soft power model, is that the just cause of freedom and liberation and justice, in this conflict. Now, with this, taking it to the international community, I think they have a serious opportunity there. But again, as Joseph Nye defined, soft power by itself only doesn't work, right? This has to be combined by some sort of a hard power, which is the hard power here, again, is the popular resistance, peaceful, non-violent resistance that the Palestinian can raise. And this speaks actually to the comparative advantage that the Palestinians have over the relationship with Israel. The Palestinians, there are 50% of the Palestinian population that are in the diaspora. They are spread all over the world, and they can contribute to the just and struggle of the Palestinians. The armed resistance has been a very exclusive, excluding the majority of the Palestinians to engage in this. Negotiation is also excluding the entire Palestinian society and restricted to the Palestinian leadership. Now, popular resistance, along with the soft power, is a very inclusive power, is a very inclusive approach that allows the Palestinian in America, in Germany, in South Africa, in Asia, and in Palestine engage in this legitimate struggle, very similar to the South African model, which is basically now you can fight for your struggle through the legal system all over the world, through universities, through the media, the think tanking. So again, and this is where again the Palestinians have an upper hand over this, because this speaks to their power and their moral power. I think this is what the model that works for the Palestinians now. And this is, again, that can, in my view, turn this into an opportunity by capitalizing on their soft power combined with the legitimate, popular resistance within the framework of the international law, where they can proceed and they can make a difference. And they don't need the UAE money. They don't need the Bahraini money. They can proceed on this and again turn this into opportunity if they do it right.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim and Tareq, for your insights. We're going to move to the questions by the audience. I'm aware of the time, but hopefully we'll be able to address as many questions as we can. Tareq, there's a question by David. He's asking, does normalization with Israel make a strategy that is based on equal rights within a single state more likely? What are the prospects that Abbas and the others will shift to the single state strategy?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that they make it more likely just in as far as they show that the current project of the Palestinian leadership is ineffective and vacuous, and is a further wake-up call. I mean, I've lost count of how many wake-up calls we've had, but it's a further wake-up call of the sense that the statehood project or the state building project has failed. So in that sense, yes, it moves us closer in that direction. But I think that when we think about the idea of equal rights in a single state, I think it's really important to understand what that means. It doesn't mean that we're looking to be equal to Israeli Jews in the current reality. It means going through a process of decolonization. It means making sure that there's justice and that there's a process of redistribution of structural historic grievances that have plagued the Palestinians for the past decades, right? So I don't think this is something that's going to come through a negotiation process. I don't think it's something that's going to come through the leadership or through the PA leadership now. It's a process that has to be revolutionary in the sense that it needs to be popular and it needs to confront the Zionist colonization that's taken root in the land of historic Palestine. I don't think the leadership is capable of adjusting or moving in that way unless they talk and discuss the things that I mentioned before, which is to go back to the institutions of liberation, whether it's that are focused on confronting a colonialist enterprise.
Thank you, Tareq. Ibrahim, there's a question. Basically, how serious are the moves toward unity by the main Palestinian factions? How likely is this unity initiative to collapse once there are actual negative effects for those Palestinians who have benefited from the old years financially and politically? What do you think about this?
If early November we see Joe Biden coming to the White House, then say goodbye to the Palestinian unity. And the reason for this is that the Palestinians now what they're doing, they're trying to work around this in order to send a voice, because this has been a uniting force for the Palestinians. Right, because it treats Fatah or the Palestinian Authority like Hamas, no difference. And the proposal that it's putting on the table of a surrender of the Palestinian, no one Palestinian from any faction is going to accept this. Right, so they forced actually a unity on the Palestinians as in the last meeting a week ago by all Palestinian factions 2 weeks ago, that they're trying to promote a unified approach. If we see Trump is going and is leaving the White House, and then Biden back to the office saying, okay, we are happy to resume negotiations, immediately the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, right, is going to embrace this with open hands and continue to live with this delusion about that this negotiation will earn the Palestinians an independence. And of course, Hamas is opposing to this, right? Because this will also mean that the Hamas, they have to renounce violence and accept all agreements signed in the past, Oslo, and offer them nothing, by the way, right? Because I don't think Hamas is against the two-state solution and the 1967 boundaries. And Tareq can correct me on this, as he's the author of a book on Hamas. But Hamas is raising the question: why should I accept this model since I'm seeing it's getting Abbas and Fatah nothing? Right? Why should I embrace it? Right. So I think this is the one major reason, again, why Hamas historically has been against negotiation, because the Fatah recognized Israel over 78% of the land, gave everything, but they got nothing. They got now what they're getting back is an apartheid model is to accept. So again, once we see Biden back, and then there is a very small hint by the White House that we are happy to support negotiations and reopen the house, the Palestinian embassy or representation office in Washington, D.C., resume some financial assistance, then you will see Abbas joining, and then back the Palestinians back to their places. If Trump continues, I do think this unity will continue, because again, Trump And the deal of the century is forcing the Palestinians to be united. And I can assure you, Noor, at least during my life, you will not find one Palestinian, regardless, right, from Hamas to Fatah to any faction that you can choose, will accept the deal of the century the way it's proposed by Netanyahu and Donald Trump. So the Palestinians will remain united if Trump remains in office. That's the way I read it.
Thank you. Tareq, would you like to add anything on the unity and its potential, or shall I ask you a different question?
I mean, I would just say one thing, which is that I agree with what Ibrahim says, but I'm a bit more skeptical about the last point he made about the Trump deal. I do agree that there isn't a single Palestinian who would accept the Trump deal the way it's presented, but I think what might happen is that they might be forced into it. So the kind of opposition to the Trump deal will be so ineffective that regardless of what the Palestinian leadership or the unities is defining, that this is a status quo that will be, or a fait accompli, I should say, that is forced on them. And I think the problem with the unity is that it's not coming within a broader project of liberation that is taking agency and moving forward. It's only reactive to what's being imposed on it, and I think that's where it becomes problematic.
Thank you, Tareq. So we have many questions, so I'm trying to merge some questions because some questions are about the same topic. So Tareq, we discussed the way forward, and there are a couple of questions on whether Palestinians should actually engage in negotiations with the state of Israel so that we can reach to discuss basically the strategy of merging two states into a single democratic state with equal rights for all. What do you think about this view that negotiation with Israel is in a way the only way forward to shift the paradigm?
I think it's important when we're thinking about this to think about a point that Ibrahim made earlier about the balance of power. There is absolutely no good that can come out of Israelis and Palestinians negotiating anything at the moment. I think the balance of power is so vast between the two that regardless of what the Palestinian position is, it will be subsumed by an Israeli position, certainly one that is now backed by the UAE, Bahrain, and the US. So I personally am against any form of negotiation between Palestinians and Israelis now. I think that what we need to be talking about is not negotiation with Israel, is within the Palestinian community, how do we resuscitate a revolutionary project that changes this balance of power? So now this balance of power is so extreme. That gap can be closed if Palestinians are able to use their strong points, including their moral legitimacy, as Ibrahim said, but also their popular power, and learn from other anti-colonial and revolutionary movements, whether it's the anti-apartheid movement in the ANC or elsewhere, how to balance power and how to close that gap with the Israelis, how to create a negotiating situation that will force the Israelis to start relinquishing some of the power that they have. I don't think we're there yet, and I would venture that we probably won't get there for a few decades yet, certainly not under the current leadership if they remain committed to their status project. So in that sense, I think rather than negotiations, we really do need to think about liberation and decolonization.
Thank you, Tareq. Of course, decolonization is such a big term, so maybe we can unpack it, but we don't have the time. Ibrahim, we have a couple of questions regarding the fourth model that you suggested on Palestinians building a soft power and drawing under the ethical and moral power and legitimacy and the just cause they are fighting for. So the first question is, where does the leadership for the soft power come from? And the second question is, historically, the soft power model didn't work for the Mufti in the 1940s. And I think it was Ian who actually gave a reference to Yusuf Sayegh, also criticizing this model and arguing that it was not enough for Palestinians to simply rely on the merit of the Palestinian cause. How would you respond to these two questions?
Well, I think they are really, really great questions and very intellectually engaging about this new, paradigm that I call the fourth paradigm. And I agree totally. And this is actually a major factor in determining the success or the failure of the fourth paradigm, which is, who's going to lead this, right? Who's the leader of this? Definitely without an inspiring, legitimate leadership, this cannot work. I agree. I surrender. I agree that this will not work without having a Palestinian Gandhi, a Palestinian Mandela, or a Palestinian Martin Luther King. Abbas is none of the above, right? So Abbas is not Gandhi, is not Mandela, and is not Martin Luther King. So you need a change of the Palestinian leadership, right? In order to be able to lead this. Now, I was asked this question whether can leadership, adjust, in order to be able to lead. Yes, there is always an opportunity, right? If the current Palestinian leadership engaged in serious reform, in uniting the Palestinians, engage in fundamental serious reform within the Palestinian society, and most importantly, gain the trust of the Palestinians. The current Palestinian leadership is not trusted by the Palestinian society. And that is why we are unable to produce the popular resistance model that Tareq also mentioned. Because, and I agree, this is the second part of your question. And as I said, with Joseph Nye defining the limitations of soft power, that by itself or soft power only will not work. It will not work in Palestine. It will not work anywhere, right? And that's why the soft power needs to be supported by the popular resistance. And the current leadership is unable to lead in a popular resistance because they have to have the trust of the Palestinian society, which they don't have. And unless they engage in deep reform and deep changes and changing of this leadership, the youngest in this current leadership is 70 years old, right? Of from the old generation of thinking about still the old way that you're leading and you're ruling. You need a young leadership to lead, a liberating leadership, an inspiring leadership, charismatic leadership, right? We don't have a charismatic leadership. But then this again, back to the discussion of an opportunity. This presents an opportunity for the Palestinians to look at what they're doing and about their leadership and see the time for change, both for Fatah and Hamas, because the current failure on the level of the Palestinian leadership is not limited to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. It's about the Palestinian leadership, that I call it, in political parties and in the formal structure of the Palestinian Authority. And I think when the Palestinians are able to achieve this, then I can assure you this will be the model or the paradigm moving forward, and would be able to change or to address the balance or the imbalance of power that we, Tareq and I agree, are major factors for resolving or liberating the Palestinians. I'm glad that Tareq disagrees with me on one thing, on the force. I stick to my position, Tareq. Whether the Palestinian will be forced to accept, you might be right? But I just don't see how the Palestinians, through force, they're going to accept the deal of the century. But again, I see your point, and I think you're making a strong point, and I'm glad to hear it, that there is a different view. But me, I just don't see how the Palestinian leadership, if Abbas, right, the most liberal, accommodating leader in the history of Palestine since Balfour Declaration, is not accepting this, that the Palestinian movement should be replacing or will be replacing, whether changing Abbas or Abbas passing away or whatever in the current leadership, leadership will be replaced by a more inspiring, right, serious leadership for the Palestinians, not going lower than the level that Abbas is going. But let's see how things go in the future.
respond. So yes, please.
No, it's not that I want to respond. I want to add one more point that I think it's a point of disagreement between the two of us, just to keep things interesting. Otherwise, we're too aligned.
That's true.
I disagree that we don't have inspiring Palestinian leaders. I think that there are many inspiring Palestinian leaders. I think we're living in a situation where there was a history of assassinations, a history of imprisonment, where now there's an authoritarian rule in both the West Bank and in Gaza that suppresses the Palestinian leaders. The people are active and they are there, and there is popular resistance. I think that we're living under a double, if not triple, system of oppression. And I think that's the structure that we need to understand and break, rather than wait for a Mandela or a Gandhi or whatever, because I do think that those leaders are out there.
Just for the record, Noor, if you allow me a very short comment. Actually, I'm in total agreement with Tareq on this point, so we're not in disagreement. I was referring only to the formal leadership of the Palestinian people in Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas leadership, and other political parties that are now outdated and that's just for the record. That's what I'm referring to. But I agree with you. There are many, many, many inspiring Palestinian leaders that are not in formal positions now, and those can make a difference. And that's why I think also Palestinians will not accept, for this even by force.
Thank you both Tareq and Ibrahim for your engaged views on this topic. And we at Al-Shabaka have published some articles on Palestinian leadership. There's a new policy lab next week on reviving the PLO, and they will be discussing as well Palestinian leadership. I'm aware of the time. We have 2 more minutes, so we will not be able to address any of the questions, but there is one question that has 2 votes, so I want to briefly, one of you maybe can answer it. Where does Jared Kushner and the money figure in? What do you think about the role that Jared Kushner has been playing? Do you have any idea, Ibrahim or Tareq?
Ibrahim, I leave this to you.
I'm not sure I understand the question. What is the question again?
The question, and I'm quoting, where does Jared Kushner and money figure in the sense of like political economy?
Yeah, I agree. I see the point. I see the question. I think this is the whole deal of the century model is built on this. I mean, you have business, real estate, people in the White House, Jared Kushner and Donald Trump, and a bankruptcy lawyer, David Friedman, and this is a whole business model. Basically, they're thinking about it is that, okay, here's $50 billion, and this will fix the Palestinian issue and end the struggle. And it's sad. It's sad to see people who are in power, in a superpower, they're thinking with this level of ignorance, right? Treating the history and people's identity and belief and dignity and human suffering, thinking that money can buy this and can solve this. It's unfortunate and sad, right? And I would say it's racist to think that people ignoring the dignity and the history and the identity and the suffering of the Palestinians, thinking that they've been suffering for almost a century now, or for more than a century, thinking that you presented $25 billion, put it on the table, right, through the Bahrain workshop that was held back in June, and thinking this will take care of it. It's a pity. It's about this level of ignorance that I can assure you it will not work. Yes, it will work with the Egyptian regime, with Sisi, who's driven financially, with all his policy in the region, right, is about how to make money, right, basically with Saudi Arabia and take money from the UAE and all of that. Yes, with that you can give him some money and we'll see this. But I can assure you, regardless of how weak the Palestinians are, their land, their dignity, their Jerusalem is not for sale. And Jared Kushner should understand this, and if not, the history will teach it.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Thank you, Tareq, as well, for your insight you gave us. I wish we had more time. If I can ask both of you to mute yourselves. Yeah, thank you. So thank you also for the participants who engaged with us today. Thank you for all your questions, and apologies that we were not able to address all of them. So in the past hour, we tried to address the nature of Arab normalization and the drivers behind it. Ibrahim gave us a critical perspective of the concept of normalization when it comes to the recent agreement that was signed between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, and instead used the concept of alliance, which is basically an alliance of interests driven by a new political and geopolitical agenda with different goals. We also, Ibrahim and Tareq also talked about the different implications of the recent agreement on the Palestinian cause. We talked about the short-term and long-term consequences and how this basically has led to the emergence of a new paradigm whereby it's no longer the land for peace model, but it's what Tareq called the peace for peace model. We also talked about the regional consequences and the effect on the balance of power. Both discussants agreed that this could be an opportunity to the Palestinians. Ibrahim presented to us his idea on how Palestinians should build on their soft power and the moral legitimacy of their cause, but this is also an idea that we can discuss in the future if we have the possibility. I think Ibrahim would be interested in that. We also provided a critical response, a critical assessment to how Palestinians, how the PA basically has so far responded to the recent efforts of Arab normalization. I hope this policy lab raised more questions for you, because it did for me. And again, thank you so much, Tareq and Ibrahim, for all your insights. It was very enriching, and I hope we can have both of you in a new policy lab in the future. And for the time being, thank you everyone again. Please stay safe, healthy, and well, and good evening or have a good day, depending on your time zone. Bye.